Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest served in the United States Marine Corps and is the author of the Christian nonfiction book, Becoming One with Christ, The Lessons of King David. His name is David Richards, and my interview with David will follow the note-taking sounds. David Richards, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Feel free to tell our listeners about your near-death experience as a child, your service in the U.S. Marine Corps, and your work in the corporate world.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So when I was 6 years old, my best friend threw a hammer in a fit of rage. The hammer hit me in the back of the head, and I was out. And what then proceeded to happen was I remember this during the pandemic, but I remember watching his brother carry my body down the street back to their house. I was about 15 feet behind him, my brother, my best friend, and his other brother, and I couldn't get back into my body. It was a very dark, kind of shadowy experience. And then the next thing I remember was waking up and my best friend was at my house. He was crying apologetically, and he bought me a coloring book. So I grew up in the military. My father was in the United States Marines for 31 years. That incident that happened when I was 6 was one of the few times that we actually lived off base. So we lived in a town called Hyattsville, Maryland, just outside of College Park near the University of Maryland. The rest of my life, mainly growing up, was spent on military bases, which is a very different lifestyle. I wanted to be a writer when I was growing up because I had some success in high school. I got something published. I got, national recognition in a magazine for my short story. But growing up in the military, especially when I did back in the prehistoric days, the world wasn't as connected as it is today. And so the pathway to how do you become a writer, what schools are available to go do that, was very limited. And we didn't have, in the military, you certainly don't make a lot of money. So there wasn't like we could do a lot of college tours. So I went to Penn State on an ROTC scholarship. I joined the Marines after graduation. And through 15 years of active duty, I spent time in Somalia. I was in the initial landing force for Somalia back in the early 90s. And then I got about 10 years into my career and realized I was reliving my dad's life, kind of like my blueprint for life was my dad's life, basically. And I started to have some reservations about continuing to do that. At the same time, I started writing poetry again, which in the military is a very unique experience because most Marines do not write poetry. So I got a lot of raised eyebrows when that started happening. At the same time, that was very exciting to me because I had, upon graduating college, believed that my writing days were behind me and that was just a childhood fantasy. And the idea or the act of writing poetry inspired the creative spark in me that actually helped me as I went through 2 master's programs in the military. And then I decided to get out because I realized in terms of the stability I wanted out of my life, I wasn't going to find it by moving every 2 or 3 years like I'd done for my entire life for the first 36 or 37 years at that point. So I got out in 2006 and went to work for Cisco Systems, the IT networking giant. And at the same time, I became a yoga instructor. It took me about 5 years of working at Cisco to truly transition out of the military because what you don't realize in the military, you share everything. I mean, you live together, you go in combat together. There's it's a very fraternal community in a very real sense because of the extremes and the parameters of life that you find yourself experiencing things in common with other people. It's not like you go have a day job and then you go home and become someone else. And so finding the boundaries in corporate America was a very interesting and unique experience a lot of the times, but it was rewarding because I started to really see that as much as I had learned in the military, it was such a small part of the world. And when you're in the military, of course, and you're looking at what's the next threat, is it China? Is it Iraq? Is it Afghanistan? What is it? The world feels very threatening and it feels very large because that's where your focus is. And then you get out and go to work for a Fortune 500 company like Cisco, and you see that there are banks and there are hospitals and there's Walmart and there's Amazon and all these customers, and everyone wants their network to optimize so they can do more business. And so it was a fun transition in that sense to learn about other perspectives and just kind of how big the world was from a corporate perspective. I did 17 years at Cisco, and then I got out in 2023, and I'd been a coach at Cisco. So I'd been an executive coach, a leadership or management coach for about 6 years when I got out. And then that's what I've been doing ever since, as well as writing a few books.
You've written the book Becoming One with Christ, The Lessons of King David. Without spoiling too much of your book, what is it about?
So there is a promise made to King David early in his rule over Israel that after he dies and is sleeping with his ancestors, his offspring, meaning Jesus, will rise up, and Jesus then has responsibility for establishing the everlasting kingdom and David's eternal throne. And so then you fast forward. So David is really happy that this promise is made to him. He's overjoyed because he recognizes what it means to be human and have this promise made to him. And then he goes and sleeps with another man's wife and has the husband killed in combat. And then he finds out that's not good. You've broken the promise. And David curses himself and turns his house against him. And the book is basically about the near-term implications of that turning the house divided, is that he has immediate problems with his family, that there's incest that goes on, there's murder that goes on within his children. And yet the book looks at what are the biblical implications of the house divided if you fast forward to the New Testament, and there are anywhere from 18 to 20 different references to Jesus as the son of David. And so it's a look at what are the implications of the covenant made to David and how does it affect our understanding of the responsibility and the authority of Jesus as the Messiah. And it's not just the Messiah for Christians, but if you look at the early followers of Jesus, and certainly Paul, they saw Jesus as the Messiah, Israel's Messiah. And so there's also a broader implication about how do you look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, three of the world's great religions, all orbiting around the same story to an extent, and how do you make sense of that? So that's kind of what the story's about, or the book's about.
An interesting fact about your book is that it reveals a biblical plot twist that a lot of Christians overlook, and that's King David does not ascend to heaven. Why is that such a critical revelation, and how does it change the way Christians understand faith and salvation?
Yeah, so it's a beautiful question. So what you're referring to is Acts 2:34, and that's where Luke is speaking or writing, and he talks about David doesn't ascend to heaven, and yet David said to the Messiah, "Sit at my right hand while I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And what's fascinating about that verse is it's in the Psalms. And then when Jesus is being questioned by the Pharisees, he says, "Whose son is the Messiah?" And they say, "David." And Jesus said, "Well, how can that be? If David says, in speaking under the Spirit of the Lord to the Messiah, sit at my right hand while I make your enemies your footstool for your feet, if David calls him Lord, how can he be David's son?" And you don't get to the answer. No one can answer that. The Pharisees can't answer that. So you get to the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation 22:16, and that's where Jesus says, "I am the root and the offspring of David," meaning I am the beginning and the end of David. So that's all New Testament stuff. Go back to the Old Testament. David has cursed himself and broken this promise on the idea of an everlasting kingdom and this perpetual throne that he is supposed to inherit, or that his son is going to establish. And even when he's told that this promise is being made to him, he's told specifically, after you are dead and sleeping with your ancestors. So there's no going to heaven. And we'll talk about the implications of that first and foremost. But then it starts to give new insight into the gravity of David's writing in the Psalms, because David writes at least on 4 or 5 different occasions about being saved from the pit. Well, what's the pit? The pit is hell, or Sheol, as the ancient Hebrews called it. Well, why would David need to be saved from the pit? The contention in the book is because he is in the pit. Because if Jesus is there's a great, this isn't something that's widely discussed, at least that I've seen in Christian circles, but I've read a lot of N.T. Wright's work. He's an English bishop. And there's the idea of federal headship or corporate representation biblically. And what that means is, in the ancient Hebrew tradition, and it is a part of Christian theology, but it's the idea that one person stands in for everyone else. And so, for example, Adam represents the fall of all humanity. It's from the get-go, humanity is has fallen. Then there's Noah. Noah represents the perseverance and a restart, basically. So, but Noah is standing in for everyone. There's Abraham. So Abraham is the father of all nations. So he's given this blessing. There's Moses, who's the lawgiver. What makes David's story interesting is that if Jesus is the Messiah and the savior of humanity, not just the savior of Christians, but the savior of humanity, there must be someone who is culpable for that. There must be someone who embodies the fall. And the fact that as Israel's second king and anointed, David then breaks the covenant. What I write in the book is that David's the fall guy, basically. And then you start to see, well, David also is the one who prophesies Jesus being crucified, because he talks about they pierced my hands and my feet. He talks about betrayal by Judas. He calls everyone a liar. So he is basically setting the stage, the implications by which Jesus must satisfy the conditions for universal salvation. So in some sense, David is the anti-hero of the Bible story based on the covenant that's made to him. And in doing that, then he stands in for the anointed who have also fallen. But what I contend in the book is that because he doesn't go to heaven, and let's talk about that for a second, because it's in Luke very explicitly, David does not ascend to heaven. The idea of the Bible story, I've just kind of picked up on this over the last few weeks of research myself. The Bible ends with God coming to earth. It doesn't end with people going up to heaven. Like the idea of the rapture that has perpetuated, I think, for the last 50 or 60 years in the United States, that is a Western and American convention. There's like one loose reference to it, I think, in Romans. But otherwise, the Lord's Prayer is about God coming to earth, on earth as it is in heaven. And so what the story then starts to expand out on is, if David doesn't ascend to heaven, then in effect, he is in Sheol or in the pit, but he's still on earth. And then I make the case, without going too far into it, he would be the anchor point, if you will, for the second coming, for Christ's return and the union of heaven and earth. David, as the fall guy, is the focal point for the reunion of heaven and earth and the restoration of all creation.
How have your diverse influences of having been in Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States at various points in your life shaped your understanding of God, Christianity, spirituality, and leadership?
What a beautiful question. Initially, so my first real exposure to foreign culture was when I was 10 years old. My family moved to Okinawa, Japan. And obviously, I had some familiarity with Okinawa because being in the Marines, I knew that there was a big battle that took place during World War II. But being a minority in a foreign country is an eye-opening experience, especially when you live there for 3 years. And to be exposed to Eastern culture, to be exposed to the spirituality as they practice it, which is a much more esoteric and established spirituality than, here we are on the verge of celebrating our 249th birthday, and Japanese culture is just a little bit older than that by a couple hundred or maybe even 1,000 years. So there's a depth and a beauty to it, but at the same time, it was hostile to my Judeo-Christian upbringing. At the same time, we got to go to the Philippines for a couple of vacations. We got to go to South Korea for a couple of vacations. And so I saw more things. I saw this incredible poverty and yet joyfulness in the Philippines, because people were living in shanty towns and bathing in dirty river water. And then we go to Seoul, South Korea, and it was the largest city I'd ever been in. I mean, it was like, I would say comparable to Los Angeles or maybe half of New York City, but it was an enormous city. So there was an eye-opening experience. And then when I was in the Marines, my first exposure to Islam was when I was in Somalia. And you hear the call to prayer go out over the loudspeakers over Mogadishu. And it's eerie because you see how devout and faithful they are. I mean, praying 4 or 5 times a day. And so that was really eye-opening. And at the same time, after we left Somalia, because I was part of the initial landing force, we were only there to allow follow-on forces to come in. So then we went up to the United Arab Emirates to clean all our equipment and our trucks and vehicles and weapons and everything. And we were there for, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks. Also a Muslim culture. And at that point, the United Arab Emirates was still fairly conservative. Now it's opened up. And if you go to Abu Dhabi, you go to Dubai, you see it's much more moderate because they have this giant ecotourism vehicle, and through the moderation of religion, they've attracted more influx of wealth and Western input. So it was still, I mean, it was still fascinating to see that, just to see the differences in the culture and be exposed to it. And then I got to go to Europe in the early 2000s with the Marines, and we were studying battlefields. And I mean, I'd always wanted to go to Europe, and I guess I'd been there in the 90s to visit my brother when he was stationed in Italy. And it's a very different experience. One, because by that point in 2005 or 2004, I guess we went there, I'd already had a lot of historical background on World War II and World War I. And it's Europe. It's where I came from. My family has background in Germany and England and Hungary. So in that sense, it was really beautiful. And you also, again, you have this appreciation for how young the United States is, because I remember going to a church in France that's 600 years old. And it just really puts things in perspective, that how long Christianity dominated European culture. And that's part of what I write about in Becoming One with Christ as well. To kind of get to the heart of your question, I wasn't a practicing Christian for much of my life. I grew up in a Christian family, and as my teenage angst came on, I started to resent my father because he was the one who was making us move all the time. And I had trouble, whether it was because of the hammer to the back of the head or just my own spiritual journey, but I had trouble making new friends. And it was more that I was so sad to leave people behind, because this was well before the time of Facebook and texting and everything else. And so I'm leaving friends that I'm never going to see again. And that was very difficult. And then as I started to fortify my adolescence, I started to take that anger out on my dad. And by the time I got to college, I was kind of in full on rebellion. And at the same time, and it wasn't that I didn't have a moral compass, because I certainly did. And I remember my freshman year at Penn State, after graduating from a small military school on the coast of North Carolina with 110 people in my graduating class, I went to Penn State, which has 35,000 people at the time on the main campus. And sex and drugs, not drugs, but sex and alcohol, kind of took on a new sense of meaning. And at the same time, I remember my freshman year specifically, like I had the sense that I'm leaving the untested waters, or I'm leaving the tested waters of faith into the unknown. Like I'm going too off into the unknown. And a big part of it for me was, honestly, when I was young, I had this download from on high that a woman was somehow going to connect me back to God. And it was this romantic kind of flair. Like I could watch Snow White or Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, and I was like, oh, that's the kind of love that I'm going to find. This is going to be so cool. And that didn't play out. I started writing poetry to girls when I was probably 8 or 9. And I remember the first girl rejected me when I was 10. And then by the time I got back to the United States and started high school, I realized my version of romance and love was completely out of touch with growing up in the 80s and discovering sex and discovering alcohol. And so those were the things that I realized I needed to surrender in order to fit in. And as I went through my military career and had all this exposure and experience, in some ways you start to question, like, well, how can the institution of Christianity, I want to be careful how I phrase this, how can the institution of Christianity as I understood it, be right when there are billions of other people on the planet, and some people who may never even heard of the story of Jesus, they can't be going to hell. Like that doesn't make sense. Um, and Going to India or going to, I became a yoga instructor coming out of the military. And even though I kind of resisted getting too familiar with Ganesh or Shiva, I understood kind of the stories, but like I didn't really relate to it because it didn't seem sensible to me. At the same time, the idea of internal unity that yoga practices and promotes made a ton of sense because that was something that I don't think growing up Christianity did a good job for me in doing. And so the idea of oneness made a lot of sense as I got into kind of the pandemic to kind of bring this all home. And I had a sense that I had an intellectual sense that the story of Jesus is true. I think what is limiting for most people is today in the world, there are 45,000 denominations of Christianity. So that means they all have different approaches and different beliefs about what's important, what's to focus on. And what I've come to realize in that, what I've come to realize in writing not only this book, but my last book, is that Jesus defies institutional religion. Like the story of Jesus is, to me, is universal. And that doesn't mean that baptism isn't important or the sacrament's not important, but the act that or the idea that you need an intermediary to have access to Jesus, obviously I grew up a Protestant, not Catholic, is such a foreign concept to me because the very idea that he is responsible for your salvation necessitates a conscious relationship with him. If we all share the mind of Christ, which comes out of 1 Corinthians 2:16, then the idea that we all have access to that mind should not be relegated to you need to go through these wickets or you need to talk to these people in order to get that relationship. So I know that was something of a long-winded answer, but hopefully that helps contextualize my response.
How long did it take you to write Becoming One with Christ, and what were the easiest and hardest aspects of writing it?
I started the book in June of last year, and I finished it at the beginning of November. So it took me, whatever that is, 6 or 7 months, about 6 months. The easiest aspect was probably pulling the tenets of the Davidic covenant out of 2 Samuel 7, like pulling the Bible, the implications of the covenant. I would say the hardest part was there's two pieces. The hardest one part was writing the history with the implications. If David doesn't ascend to heaven, then he is somehow perhaps the vanguard of Christianity's advance across Western civilization, the spirit of David, the essence of David. And so looking at history and especially the European conflicts of the 20th century through that lens was hard. And then the last section of the book is called Bearing the Cross because Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. And so the last section was very difficult because it was very raw. It's my look at the last, from 2020 to 2024, what I went through to fortify the faith within me.
Is your book Becoming One with Christ independently, traditionally, or hybrid published?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a hybrid publisher. So I went with Christian Faith Publishing. So they did the editing for me. They did all the publication. I did the raw work, and then I've got a marketing campaign that's underway too.
Do you plan on or are you considering writing more books? And if so, what are some ideas for books you will or may write in the future?
Oh, wonderful question. So I'm working on one of my books and turning it into a screenplay. That's actually my second book called The Lighthouse Keeper, and I finished the screenplay yesterday. It is begging for a sequel, so I would write a sequel to that because there's a romance piece that is untouched. And then my third book, which came after, obviously, The Lighthouse Keeper, that I wrote during the pandemic, is called Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, The Resurrection of King David. And that I would love to write a sequel to as well. In fact, I wrote one, and it's called Love Letters to Jesus, the Heart of Ragnarok. I would love to revisit that because I think what I wrote is good, but I don't think it's the direction I would take it now that I've done more work and more writing. And I think I'd like to write something more about,
I've written two courses to go along with becoming one with Christ. One's called Being One with Christ. So kind of taking it further, how do you actually change your nervous system and rewire your physiology? And then the second course is called the Davidic Covenant and what the implications of the Davidic Covenant are. So short answer is a sequel to The Lighthouse Keeper and a sequel to Love Letters to the Virgin Mary.
One final question, and this is about your work as a professional coach. You blend faith, leadership, and neuroscience in your coaching work.
Yep.
How does understanding the mind, and including understanding concepts like neuroplasticity, and I believe NLP stands for natural language processing?
It's actually neuro-linguistic. That is one definition of the acronym.
Neuro-linguistic processing help people step into their most powerful and authentic leadership.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So a lot of times what I find in my coaching, I work with executives from different companies, Fortune 500 companies, and a lot of them divide who they are. In other words, they show up at work as one person, but they leave part of who they are at home. And they feel like that's not suitable. It could be because maybe they do yoga in their private life and they don't feel like they can present that. Or maybe they do meditation in their private life and they don't feel like they can present that. And what ends up happening is when you divide yourself like that, you're not bringing your full self to work. So that creates dependencies where people are looking for validation from their boss or from their peer group. So what I do is help integrate all of who they are and say, if you do yoga, do yoga. And I had a great experience when I was at Cisco where I was invited to lunch with a senior vice president, and there were, I think, 4 of us at lunch. And she said, I know 2 of you are into yoga. Does one of you want to do a quick meditation breathing exercise for us? I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. It was a really cool experience to have that recognized. So bringing all of who you are to work makes your work more productive and makes you more fulfilled. From a neuroscience or neuroplasticity, neuro-linguistic programming is the idea that when you understand how the mind works, so just really simply, you've got the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. The conscious mind is the world where we process through our 5 senses, and 10% of our bodily functions work through the conscious mind. The subconscious mind is where our feelings are, our habits, our beliefs. So what ends up happening is people tell themselves a story. Let's say in high school, I wasn't good at math. And after a while, I just told myself I'm not good at math anymore. And that became true. Why that became true was not because I had bad grades, but because I told myself that enough times where it imprinted that thought onto my subconscious mind. And as a result, that just became my reality. I'm not good at math. And then when I got to college and had to take calculus, I had to figure out how to become good at math. So a lot of times people, through the things they say to themselves, or even sometimes what other people say to them, program themselves with these limiting beliefs. And what I do in terms of neurolinguistic programming is interrupt their pattern. So when you interrupt the pattern, it like creates a schism in someone's thought process. If they go into this trance where they repeat what they say, or like, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at this, you interrupt the process, and then you can insert something in. What if you were great at it? How would you feel? And it's like it resets their hard drive almost. It resets their computer, so to speak. When you think about other ways to do that, there are techniques called anchoring, where you can have someone anchor a feeling in, and they can access that feeling just by squeezing their thumb and index finger together. So through the coaching practice, it's really about helping people realize that everything they need is already inside them. And in some cases, they've just closed it off through the limiting beliefs that they've told themselves and then imprinted on their subconscious mind. So what I do is rewire that, help them create new empowering beliefs so that they can take off and excel at promotion, excel at whatever they're trying to accomplish.
David, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest to interview.
Oh, Aaron, thank you so much. I really appreciate that time. What beautiful questions, and I'm glad I was able to speak with you.
It was interesting to interview David about his work as an author. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.